Bum, 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 bum. It is Thursday. And we got a UFC fight card this weekend. Marina Rodriguez versus Amanda Lemos. A card that I am struggling to decide on whether I think it's good or not. Because the problem with the card, just in a nutshell, is there are a bunch of fights that could potentially be really, really good. There is a version of these fights that is gangbusters and that you're going to really enjoy watching fight. With a few exceptions. There are fights on this card that don't have that version. But there are like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 fights out of the 12 that could be really, really good. But by that same token, there are no fights that I can't also conceive of being pretty bad. And there's a fight on there, Chase Sherman versus Josh Parisian, that I am fairly certain is going to be bad. So you have that on top of that, and also the Polyana Viana versus Jinyu Fry fight. Before we get into the fight predictions, let's talk about the UFC roster cuts, because at the end of last month, from about October 30th to 31st, there were a bunch of people who left the UFC's employ. Askar Askarov, Krzysztof Yatko, Misha Serkinov, Louis Cauchy, Nick Maximov, Magomed Mustafayev, Charlie Altaveneros, Jesse Ronson, Cameron Van Camp, all gone for either being cut or contracts expiring and not being renewed or not coming to a deal, or in the case of Askarov, and I suspect Mustafayev, the fighter essentially asking to be released from their contract for reasons beyond the UFC's control. Let's talk about these just, I guess, in order. Askarov, of course, we know simply it's a medical issue. I haven't seen anywhere report what the medical issue is, essentially. But he asked the UFC because his fight against Brandon Royval, which he missed weight for, was going to be his last one in the UFC, was the last one on his UFC contract. And he asked that to be actually just honored. So he's gone, not necessarily because the UFC wants him gone, but because he is taking some time to recuperate, recover. Maybe this is a retirement. I don't know. We'll see what happens there. Krzysztof Yatko, not surprising. He's been around for like a really, really long time. Makes a, by UFC standards, decent chunk of money and isn't super exciting. I do think that he's the type of guy that you really want to keep around. And the reason I say this is someone brought this up with Jared Vanderraa. Although I fundamentally disagree with it on Vanderraa, I do actually agree with it on Yatko. Yatko is a guy who can ask newcomers, developing fighters, a specific question and see how they come up with an answer to it. And I think that is actually relatively important. But I'm not surprised that he's gone. Misha Serkinov is gone as well. Speaking of a guy that Yatko beat. Not surprised by that. I'm a big Misha Serkinov fan. I've met him in person. Super awesome dude. Seriously, great personality. Great grappler. Fantastic grappler. Scary, strong guy. But for a long time has not really put it together in the UFC. And does have just some fundamental flaws as a fighter. Specifically in terms of durability. So honestly, not surprising. Louis Cauchy was surprised when they signed him, to be honest. Didn't really think he had a lot. Didn't think he was super exciting or anything. But I guess if you're willing to sign the Dana White Contender Series contract of 10-10, the barrier to entry is pretty low. Nick Maximo is probably the only guy I think I feel bad about getting cut here. Two. Cameron Van Camp's the other one. But Nick Maximo, I feel a little bit bad about. I think, on one hand, it's a good thing that he is out of the UFC. Because I think he needs to learn. I think he needs to focus on becoming a more complete fighter. Being able to strike out of the same stance that he grapples out of would be or wrestles out of, would be a massive boon to him. Because that was the thing I kind of noticed after his Brundage fight. Didn't really notice it in the Brundage fight, but I noticed it after that, is he literally has to change stances when he goes for shots. And if you think about this just like in a general note, the reaction time to get a takedown is already pretty strong if it's just a shot takedown. There's a technical aspect to it, but like there's an explosiveness and just denying your opponent time to react. If you have to change stances, then shoot, you're always going to be at a disadvantage. So, and his stand-up is really quite poor. I'm surprised in the sense that he's 2-2 in the UFC, and his last loss was against Jacob Malkoun in a fight where he screwed up his leg. And I'm not going to say Malkoun wasn't going to win that fight without that injury, but there was nothing leading up to that injury that suggested that Malkoun was going to have an easy time with that fight. So it's a bit weird that he's gone, but I suppose there is the point that the entry-level UFC contract tends to be 4 fights. So his fight contract is up. Part of the reason they signed him to begin with was his connection to the Diaz brothers, which presumably the UFC is less interested in preserving. So I guess it's not surprising that he would be let go. Magomed Mustafayev, I had a really long conversation with somebody on Twitter about this one. His takeaway was that he thought Mustafayev was like running away from fights, and that's why he would get released. But I think that my takeaway from this is that you got to remember Mustafayev was booked against 3 separate opponents for UFC 280. And they all fell apart, and they were not his fault that they fell apart. He's been a very ducked fighter. He has something like 11 bookings over his UFC time that have fallen apart because the other fighter pulled out, either because of injury or because of otherwise issues that prevented them from fighting. And he, of course, is a guy who has always had visa issues. He's not fought in the United States since 2015, I think. So with the UFC doing less international events, partially because of COVID protocols, partially because I think since the WME takeover, every dollar has to be justified way more. And it's cheaper for the UFC to put on a fight in the Apex Center in Vegas than it is to go over to the Czech Republic or to Croatia or whatever to do a fight night card. I think you're going to see like a lot less of those. So if you have Mustafayev, a guy you can't book in the UFC, and you're going from something like 20 international events down to like maybe 10, you're just going to have less opportunities to get him in there. And he also had a PED suspension, which was not really a PED suspension. He was one of the Russian fighters who was caught up in I don't remember the drug's name now, but there was a heart medication commonly prescribed in Eastern Europe that made its way onto the prohibited substance list of USADA. So the fighters had to stop using it. And to make matters worse, based on my reading on the matter, and if someone else has more expertise in this, please feel free to contradict me. The half-life of the drug was longer than the time between the positive test and the banning of the drug. So what I'm saying is that the fighters that got busted, there were like 8 of them, could not have tested clean for this drug just because they would have had to have stopped before something like 4 months before it was actually made into a PED, quote unquote, PED, to actually have tested clean. So really it was just USADA setting them up for failure, like saying this thing that you have a medical prescription for is now illegal, and we're going to test you for it before it's out of your system. That was a bit weird. So he had that. He's also had two major surgeries. I do believe a back surgery and a knee surgery. I think he had a long-term arm issue as well. But if I recall the timeline, he elected to get the back surgery while that was healing up. So he hasn't fought. All this is saying he hasn't fought a lot, and he's probably not going to fight a lot. So I would imagine that this is somewhat of a mutual parting of ways, so that he can, pursue his regional career essentially. Charlie Altafaneros, Jesse Ronson, not surprising on either one. Honestly, a little bit surprised either of them ever made it to the UFC. Ronson was a good fighter and had a good long career, but at the same time is a guy who never struck me as having the physicality or the technical depth to actually compete in the UFC. He was one of those guys who's like gets away with a lot of stuff by being physical for the regional scene, and was never going to be physical for the UFC. And Ontiveros, I have no idea why they signed him. He was a mean fighter. Like I guess what they wanted was to see him get a win by axe kick, and that was about it. But like, no structure to his game, no nothing. He was terrible. And Cameron Van Camp, I'm a little surprised Cameron Van Camp is gone. And the reason I'm a little surprised by that is that he did take a short notice booking for them. He did them a solid. And I guess I shouldn't be surprised by this anymore, but those kind of guys I usually think should at least get to fight their contract out. So I feel a little bit bad for Cameron Van Camp. I feel bad for Magomed Mustafayev and Askar Askarov for the situations that have led to them being cut. Although with Mustafayev, that is also balanced out by the fact that to have visa issues suggests some kind of unsavory element of his association or his character. So I guess there's that. Let's get on to the fights. So we're talking at the top here between Amanda Lemos, Marina Rodriguez. I have always forget that Marina Rodriguez is 35. Like they're both 35 years old. This is a 70-year-old main event, which is kind of surprising. Rodriguez is the taller fighter, 5'6" to 5'4". Apparently, they have the same reach. I don't think I actually believe that because I think Rodriguez has a way longer reach than Lemos. Like I understand Lemos has pretty long arms for a 5'4" fighter, but at the same time, like Rodriguez has long arms for a 5'6" fighter. So I have to assume that there is a reach advantage here to play with. Lemos also had some travel issues for this fight due to the political unrest in Brazil. I think she had a twice delayed fight, so that could also be an X factor that comes into play. And keep in mind, Lemos' cardio has always been kind of this big question mark. There's not a fight where she's like horrendously gassed, but there are various fights that show her slowing down as opposed to getting stronger as the fight goes on or even keeping up the same volume that she has at the start. So there is some definite questions there. Rodriguez is the more trustworthy fighter in a nutshell. Like Marina Rodriguez is a good in every way fighter. Like there's a reason that she's kind of in title contention. Although it's not sexy and exciting in that regard. She throws good volume. She'll throw in combination. She'll throw with some variety. She has good cardio. Any questions about Lemos' cardio do not come over to Marina Rodriguez's. She does not have the greatest takedown defense in the world. She utilizes her range for that, but like if you can solve the range and you can step in, Carla Esparza, for example, you can get her down pretty easily. Now, Mackenzie Dern could not. So obviously there is a threshold there to make it happen. And while I believe Lemos could have some success earlier for that, she's not the greatest takedown artist, realistically speaking. Like she's good in the clinch. She's very strong. Like she is the power fighter, both in terms of how hard she hits and how much power she just has physically. If she gets an arm or she gets your neck, it is a life-altering experience. And she can get good takedowns from the clinch and she can hurt people. But you have to imagine that Rodriguez probably can avoid a fair amount of that. Like she can play the outside game, skirt around the outside of the pocket, utilize the pocket periodically, and just kind of wear Lemos down over the course of this fight. And again, Lemos has that X factor of the issues with travel. So while I wouldn't be at all surprised to see Lemos win this fight early with like a big power shot or a big vice grip submission hold of some kind. And I think, actually, to be honest, this fight is a lot better if Lemos can actually dictate some of the action. I just think that Rodriguez's range, footwork, speed, volume, general striking acumen, and the fact that her problem with takedowns tends to be someone who can have very potent shot entries. Not necessarily physically, but like on a technical level, while masked and everything, which Carlos Barz is very, very good at. And Lemos is not very good at. This is... It's not the Dern Rodriguez fight, but it is much closer to that platform, I think. Means I have to go with Marina Rodriguez. I wouldn't be surprised if it goes the distance and she wins a decision. I also wouldn't be surprised if she gets a late TKO, just like kind of on a tired Lemos. So one of those two things I think is more likely. The betting odds kind of agree with this. Rodriguez is minus 225, plus 190 on Lemos, according to best fight odds. I think that's pretty solid. I think that's pretty accurate to how this fight's going to go. Like, Lemos has an absolute pathway to victory. It's just, I see Rodriguez being able to exploit the limitations to Lemos' game as the fight goes on. Neil Magny versus Daniel Rodriguez. Obviously, Magny is always a guy who has massive physical advantages in the sense that he's 2 inches taller, he's 6 inches longer. But like, his best work is always in the clinch. Like, he never really has developed that outside game that you'd probably kind of hope for. He's a tough dude. He's a durable dude. He comes up with solutions that are surprising. I think that was like the hallmark of his UFC run. And even like his tough run back in the day is just that, like, he'll have moments almost every time, but like, there are also fights where he just gets kind of blown out of the water, and often he gets blown out of the water by people who can do range striking. And what I'm getting at is D-Rod has that. He's got good volume boxing. It's kind of weird because he had that flat performance against the Leech, which he quote unquote won. Air quotes around that, please. I thought Leech won. Most people thought Leech won. I don't think it doesn't really trickle onto like my worst decisions of all time list, because there have been some terrible ones. Even recently. The Tim Means win on the last card, for example, where I can't even fathom the logic of it. But it does feel like he's still on the way up, even though he's an older fighter. I want to say he's 35 years old because I believe he was born in 86. I believe that's the whole deal with the tattoo across his chest or across his back. I can't remember. He's got the 1986 tattoo on him. Yeah, he's 35 years old, 10 months, 5 days at the time of the fight. So there you go. He still seems to be learning though and getting better. Like, he doesn't seem like an old fighter, whereas I think Magny does kind of feel like that. So that's tipping me to Rodriguez, that hopefully he can come out here, show us some new tricks, whereas what Magny's going to show is just what Magny is going to show. The Max Griffin fight was a lot closer than I thought it was going to be. And I think Rodriguez is actually suited to just staying away from the clinch, which is Magny's biggest weapon. So I am going with Rodriguez by decision, but it could go in either way, and the betting odds are definitely pointing that direction because you got Magny, the favorite, again, air quotes, minus 116, Rodriguez minus 104. This is actually, interestingly, the only underdog. And it's not much of an underdog, but it is the only underdog on the card I'm picking. Josh Parisian versus Chase Sherman. This fight sucks. I don't have a ton more to say about that. Sherman's been in and out of the UFC a couple times. I'm a little surprised Parisian's still in. Did Parisian ever lose back-to-back fights? I guess that's the one thing I gotta ask. And it looks like no. The losses to Parker Porter and Dontel Mays were separated with that win over Roque Martinez. And obviously he's coming off the win over Alan Badeau. Sherman is only really good at one thing, and that is offensive boxing. And you'll note that I don't say boxing because his defense is bad. But Parisian doesn't exactly have the most explosive or the most varied striking game on the planet. It's pretty meat and potatoes into a takedown game. Yes, he does have that spinning back fist knockout on the Contender Series, and yes, he has shown flashes where he can kind of do similar things, but generally speaking, he's really just kind of a standard regional heavyweight. And Sherman, well, I do not think of much of his skills. He is pretty physical. Like, he is pretty athletic. He's got all the physical needs to be a UFC heavyweight. He just doesn't have the technical aspects to back it up. So basically, you got Parisian, who just kind of has a fine average game with probably sub-average physicality. You have Sherman, who has a very narrow game, but above average physicality. I am going to go with Sherman by decision because Parisian is really tough. The only time I think I've seen him finish was the Dontel Mays fight, and that wasn't so much losing consciousness, but as much as the famous fight where like Mays got crucifix and was dropping his groin on his face. It was just a positional TKO that Sherman's not likely to replicate. So Sherman by decision. I have no idea why this is on the main card. Tadger Ulanbekov versus Nate Maness. This is a fight that has become way more interesting in the wake of Ulanbekov losing to Tim Elliott. Because going into the fight with Tim Elliott, Ulanbekov was a pretty hot prospect. Like, good top grappler, good physicality, actually has pretty good stand-up. Like, there's no venom to it. He doesn't hit particularly hard. It's just kind of noise. But, like, it's not bad. Like, he throws in combination reasonably well. He throws decent volume. He throws reasonably good variety. Like, he'll vary up his targets. He'll hit the body. He'll hit the head. Body work is painfully underrepresented in UFC. In MMA in general, I should say. Anytime I say lacking in the UFC, I mean the sport as a whole. Because let's face it, this is the highest level of MMA. So if it's lacking here, you know it's lacking further down. Maness is, he's kind of like Tim Elliott. He's a bigger version. He's 3 inches taller and 2 inches longer. And to my knowledge, has never fought at flyweight, which Elliott did. But he's also a lot less creative than Elliott. Like, Elliott's whole thing is, I don't necessarily know if I want to call Elliott creative, because creativity implies that there's a hope that it'll work, that there's a rhyme or rationale to it. Elliott is just weird and janky. There we go. Janky is the word I would use. Like, he's just confusing. And Maness is not. Maness is a standard sort of pressure fighter guy, strike into a takedown sort of deal. And that's worked remarkably well because he's exceptionally durable and he'll push the pace. And he's big. Like, again, he's a 5'10" bantamweight. That's huge. And he's not a stick. I have no idea how he makes the weight. He's also kind of famous for like the fact that I always confuse him for Nate Landwehr. I still think he's like really reliant on like taking Ulanbekov down though, and I still don't think that there's really a pathway to victory. Elliott did utilize that somewhat, but Elliott also utilized volume striking, jankiness, and let's not forget fouls. Like, Tim Elliott put on a clinic of like, how many times can you get warned for the same foul with the referee not taking a point away? Just keep doing it. You might as well. Like, it made a mockery of the whole like rule system of MMA, to be honest. I'm going with Ulanbekov by decision, but like, that Elliott fight should have people nervous. He's still coming in at a minus 225 favorite to plus 190 on Maness. I think that's a little too wide. Again, like, Maness is not that dissimilar with what he wants to do to Tim Elliott. He's dissimilar in how he goes about it, but in some ways he's actually better and also, again, way bigger. So I'm worried about it. Mark Manson versus Grant Dawson. This is an interesting fight because you have two guys who are used to having a wrestling advantage, and they're probably not really going to have one. Like, Manson's wrestling. He's an Olympic Greco-Roman wrestler. doesn't necessarily translate all that well to MMA because he doesn't have the introductions to it. He doesn't have the ways to force a wrestling game onto his opponents. And as a result, he's developed this actually pretty solid striking game. It's incredibly meat and potatoes. It is incredibly basic, but it is very well schooled, very well honed. It is low kicks, it is jabs, and he'll pump the jab 1-2 times, then bring the power hand in. And he's just very cool under pressure. He's also 38 years old. He's 10 years older than Grant Dawson. Dawson's stand-up is worse if we're talking about polish because it's not terribly deep either. It's maybe a little bit more deep, like he'll try a little bit more different things, but it's not really any better. It's probably worse. But he's younger. He's got more of his athletic upside. I'm not going to say he's better athlete because honestly, I think if you lined up Mark Madsen and Grant Dawson side by side at every age, Madsen probably is a better athlete, but we got 10 years of wear and tear to talk about here. So Dawson, probably the more explosive guy right now, probably the faster guy, has the better way of implementing a wrestling game, but in no way do I believe Dawson takes Madsen down as a function of just wrestling. Like as a function of setting it up with hurting him on the feet, or getting the better of him in the striking, making him focus on the striking, and then slipping into a takedown. Like, I could see that. But, like, in terms of, like, a strict, like, just coming out, going for the entry, getting in on the hips, trying to get him down, I don't see that happening. Like, I see Madsen being able to shut that down. Still, I got to go with Dawson. Like, again, 10 years younger, is at a new camp, seems to be learning things. Last couple of fights, like, 2 fights have been a notable upgrade for him. Like I thought I really liked what he did against Jared Gordon. And had he not gassed out against Ricky Glenn, I think I would have liked that performance as well. But yeah. Madsen just found MMA, I think, a little bit too late in life. Like, you're debuting. How old was he when he debuted? Because he's 38 now. He debuted against Philippe Hens in 2000. Okay, he's been at it since 2013. Okay, I was thinking that he was a lot shorter than that. Okay. Oh, okay. He had 2 fights. He had a fight in 2013, a fight in 2014. Went and did the Olympic Games, and then came back to MMA in 2018. Okay, so he's been like full-time MMA from like 34 onwards. That's why I'm thinking differently. But it really is just a youth pick. And it looks like the bettors are on my side on that because Dawson's minus 220. Madsen is plus 185. Hasn't lost in MMA. Hasn't lost. Will this be the first one? Derek Minner versus Shalan Nurembeke. I really like Nurembeke's last name. Nurembeke has all like the physical attributes you could want, but like has a bunch of prospect losses. A bunch. Do I think Minner could possibly beat him here? Sure. Minner's got a super dangerous, super venomous ground game. Like he'll go for chokes from everywhere. He'll burn himself out doing that, but lately he's been trying to adjust himself into being like a more complete fighter and one that doesn't gas out incredibly quickly because I mean, we're talking about Nurembeke having a bunch of losses. He's got 10. Minner's got 13. So this is 23 losses on a UFC fight night. Is not something you see a lot of. I have to go with Nurembeke. I think Minner is making the right adjustments to try to be a more complete, more competent, more winning fight-to-fight fighter. But I ironically think his best bet here is just go old school, classic OG Minner, which is just scramble hard for his neck. Just do that because that's the only thing that I think he does better. Nurembeke is a physical specimen. He's got good wrestling. He's got good power striking. Do not let the record fool you. He is actually a really solid fighter. And I think he's going to win this one here by TKO. Nuremberg minus 209 favorite, plus 179 on Minner. That could stand to be a lot wider. And the widest odds on the card is Miranda Maverick minus 650 versus plus 475 for Shannon Young. Aside from Maverick being 5'3", there is no real reason that she should lose this fight. She is 4 inches shorter, but does actually have a reach advantage. She is built like a tank, massively strong. The only other concern, I guess, possible is that she recently moved to the Elevation MMA camp. And that is a camp that hasn't had the greatest out of the gate success. I think this is her second fight with them. And there is the question of like, is she potentially still settling in to that role? And the losses to Macy Barber and Erin Blanchfield are fairly recent, even though I think she beat Barber. But no offense, beating Gina Mazzani doesn't tell me anything good. Shanna Young fights like someone who thinks that she's a really good athlete, and she's not. So I've got Maverick by TKO. Like there really shouldn't be anything that Young brings to the table, physically or technically, that Maverick's not ready for. And yeah, that's why she's the biggest favorite on the card. Mario Bautista versus Benito Lopez. Okay, I take it back. This fight should be dope. Studying for this one, I watched Benito Lopez versus Albert Morales again. And if you've not watched that fight ever, or if you've not watched that fight recently, do yourself a favor and go watch that. That is a phenomenal fight. Phenomenal scrap. It's not one that left me thinking either guy had a long run in the UFC. Do not get me wrong, but it was fantastic. It is candy for the fight fan. Lopez has a lot of problems here. He's not fought in 3 years. He only fought 4 times in the 2 years prior to that. So I don't really know where he is physically in his career right now. And then on top of that, his style is just kind of a wild man. He's super aggressive on the feet with jumping knees, all kinds of strikes, not lacking for volume, not lacking for cardio, not lacking for toughness. But he is definitely lacking for like defense and structure and really calmly put together fight ideas. And Bautista has some problems, specifically that one, he's going to have 4 inches less of reach to Lopez. And a lot of his defense is that insulation by reach. It's a lot of like just keeping people away from him. And Lopez, because he's longer and because he's insane, is not going to let him do that. And he's quite counterable. I've seen Bautista do some good things lately. I've not seen Lopez in some time. Even when I did see Lopez, I had massive concerns about his defense and his longevity. Whereas we saw Bautista really kind of lay it on Jay Perrin, really kind of lay on Brian Kelleher recently. Really solid win over Miles Johns as well. There is that loss to Trevin Jones in the mix of that. So Lopez's craziness and Bautista's lack of really functional defense could give Lopez a lot of upset potential here. But he's been out for too long, and I think Bautista has a way more structured game. So I'm going with Mario Bautista by decision. Could be a finish though. Like he throws a lot of nice like knee strikes and like does have a really good submission game. Lopez will give up his back when there's on a grappling because he's like super aggressive. He'll be like, so I'm gonna go for that arm triangle. I'm gonna go for it. Wait, why are you on my back? And I could totally see that kind of moment happening in a ground exchange between these two. But yeah, I'll say decision because Bautista's not a amazing finisher, and Lopez is super tough. So I'll go with that. He is also Batista is also the favorite, minus 315. Lopez is plus 265, which is one of the wider lines on the card. Jinyu Fry, Polyana Viana. Oh god, this fight sucks. Okay, so this is the second fight that is just gonna suck. Jinyu Fry ticks all the boxes, physically speaking. Fast, powerful, strong. Actually, pretty technical. She is painfully low output and doesn't adapt. She is route. Everything she does has nothing to do with what the opponent is doing. And she's also 37 years old. Viana is 2 inches taller, 2 inches in reach. I don't want to pick her because she's also bad. She's like this mindless zombie jiu-jitsu player who is just aggressive and will pull guard and will work from bottom even when she's getting absolutely nothing done, and will throw the worst looking strikes you've ever seen. And I'm sure both of these ladies are lovely, but I have no interest in this fight. Viana is the minus 144 favorite, plus 124 for Fry. It's one of these painful ones where, like, Fry, if she ever could just put it together, actually is a good fighter, whereas Viana, I think, is just terrible. But I'll go with Viana by decision. She'll fight. She'll fight for 15 minutes. And I'm not entirely sure that Fry will. So there you go. Johnny Munoz Jr. versus Ludwig Shalinian. Actually, a pretty interesting fight. Shalinian has a pretty good background in both striking and wrestling. It did not show up at his Jack Shore fight, so I think that's left a negative connotation to his name. I know it did for me. Like I remember looking back at some of his other fights, I'm like, this guy is way better than I think anyone remembers him being, because the Shore fight was really one-sided. But I still do have to take Munoz. The thing is, I've seen Munoz win at a UFC level. I think he's bare bones. I think there's a lot of like predictability to him. But he throws good volume. There's a little bit of creativity there. He's got an excellent back tape game. Good physical prospect. Good athleticism. Good takedowns. Can scramble. Still very unproven, but like, is Shalinian really that much better than, say, Jamie Simmons? Probably, actually. That's a bad example. Simmons is also incredibly short. So maybe a bad example, but had a competitive fight with Nate Maness, who's up higher on the card, and was actually having an okay fight with Tony Gravely until just getting knocked dead. And I don't think Ludovic has anywhere near the power that Tony Gravely does. So my concerns about him being like someone who probably doesn't have the greatest chin in the world and probably doesn't have the greatest defense in the world are somewhat mitigated by the fact that I don't really think Shalinian hits hard enough to finish him. Munoz by decision, just because if Jack Shore couldn't finish Shalinian, he fought his way out of some submissions there, some chokeholds. I know it was a super late notice fight, and also Shore was apparently injured going into the fight. But at the same time, to have the dominant positions on Shalinian and not finish him points somewhat poorly to Shore's finishability, but also it points towards Shalinian being a guy who, even under incredible duress, will make, generally speaking, the right decisions to see another day. And Munoz is the minus 250 favorite, 2 plus 210 for Shalinian. Jake Hadley versus Carlos Candelario. Same reach, about the same height, which is surprising because I always think of Candelario as being like fairly lanky and tall. I guess not. I don't really know what Candelario's game is supposed to be at a UFC level. He's got excellent cardio. He's a 5'8" flyweight, which is pretty tall. Maybe it's more that I just think of Hadley as being more compact than he is. Um, long reach, volume, energy. But realistically, he has no way of defining a fight. There's no super scary striking game. There's no particularly great wrestling game. There's no super venomous ground game. He's a guy who kind of is just I mean, he does have a bunch of finishes on the regional scene. He has a TKO in Cess back in 2018. He has a rear naked choke back in 2015, guillotine choke in 2016, rear naked choke against a reasonably decent fighter in Miguel Restrepo. TKO over Timothy Wheeler, but nothing says venom and nothing says super deep ability about him. Whereas Hadley did lose his debut, so there's a little bit of heat off of him against Alan Nascimento. But I think we also know that Alan Nascimento actually pretty good. Charles Oliveira's student, kind of a flyweight Charles Oliveira in a nutshell, who's gone 1-1, did lose to Ulanbekov, but actually had a pretty good fight there. And Hadley's got a really good top game, good control, good entries on his takedowns, has some variety to them, strikes perfectly fine, has a little bit of nice pop in his punches. I got to go with Hadley by decision. And he's a minus 250 favorite to the plus 210 underdog in Carlos Candelario. And then the fight, the night will open up with Ramona Pascual plus 112 against Tamaris Vidal minus 132. I don't know what to make of this fight. Pascual is the bigger fighter. She's 2 inches taller. Apparently has less reach. I'm sure I buy that. And she is definitely a little bit bigger. Vidal feels like someone who could probably make flyweight. I think. She's probably not. She's fairly thick in her own right. But Pascual's coming down from 145. She didn't look out of place at 145. So she's a legitimately big girl. Probably another one of these fighters that the UFC just is refusing to book at 145, despite having signed a 145er. Chelsea Chandler, another example of that. The whole Aspen Ladd fiasco. Macy Jason. It's just weird. I've seen a couple of interviews with Ramona Pascual, and I want good things for her because she seems like an incredibly nice person, and she also seems like she's making the right choices. Realistically, every time out, she's adapting something that I think makes her a better fighter. But I just think that there's a physicality ceiling, and there's no deep well of surprising technique from her. She kind of needs the front foot to be effective. She throws good volume, but there's not a ton of variety there. There's not a ton of variant. She doesn't make things happen. There's not a lot of physicality. I think she's reasonably strong in the clinch, but that's about it. Not particularly fast, not particularly explosive. And the one thing I don't think was a good idea, she went to Syndicate MMA. And I feel like Syndicate MMA is a gym that to make their style work, unless you're Roxanne Modaffari, basically, you kind of have to be someone who's comfortable being on the back foot periodically because they really, really like to work an outside game. And she's not. She really wants to try to come inside and do some things. Now for Vidal, who is also uninspiring. Aggressive grappler. calm and confident in long exchanges, but I don't think she's very good. I don't think she's particularly powerful or particularly fast. Not particularly explosive on the takedown. Seems to get tired. Like I haven't seen her like gas out, but seems to get tired. But then picks up a win. So I mean, it's a bit of a weird one. Really, really, really hard fight to pick because I don't have a ton of faith either way. I really don't. I will go with Vidal because she can make big moments happen, and Pasquale does leave something to be desired as a scrambler and defensive grappler. Like Vidal probably just at some point ends up with an arm, most likely, or a choke, or a leg lock, and get the submission. But I don't know. I hope I'm wrong. Like I said, like with Pasquale, like seems like a super nice lady, and with Vidal, there's like a decent like record to work on there. But I don't know. Women's bantamweight. What can I say? Kind of reminds me. Someone asked for thoughts on Ronda Rousey in the Discord. The other day. I think more or less people are on the same page. Like that she was great, was probably a little bit ahead of her time, and was like a physical presence that can't be denied. But it got me thinking. Let me pull up the UFC rankings here real quick for women's bantamweight. But you look at the UFC bantamweight rankings, and assuming that Ronda Rousey could be relied upon immensely to fight, you look at the top 15 and you're like, she would definitely beat Josiane Nunes, Lena Landsberg, Julia Vila probably. Misha Tate she already did beat. I have no faith that Carol Hossa would beat her after watching her fight Landsberg. I have no faith that Chasen would beat her. She beat Pannie Kianzad, I think, fairly easily. I don't really have any faith that Yana Kunitskaya would beat her, or Raquel Pennington, or Irene Aldana. And that more or less just leaves us with like Nunez, Pena, Ketlin Vieira, Holly Holm. And like, I don't know. I guess that's just my argument for like the idea that like women's bantamweight has moved past the Ronda Rousey point. I don't think it really has. Like the absolute elite of the division, yes. But they're the people that beat her already, basically. I don't actually, you know what? She might be able to beat Pena. Anyways. That's the predictions for this fight card. Betting odds. Vidal is the favorite, minus 132, plus 112 on Pasquale. I don't even know how you can decide the odds on this fight. Like, I don't know. This fight, the Viana Frey fight, and the heavyweight fight are almost all doomed to just not being particularly enjoyable for me. It's weird, though. It could be a good card. There is upside to it. What do we got coming up next? From ye old UFC, we have got UFC 281. That'll be good, or at least that should be. Adesanya versus Alex Pereira, Carlos Esparza versus Weili Zhang, Dustin Poirier, Michael Chandler, Frankie Edgar, Chris Gutierrez, Dan Hooker, and Claudio Puelles, and a kind of under the radar banger on the prelims, Brad Riddell versus Renato Moicano. Am I the only one that thinks that Aaron Blanchfield, Molly McCann should be higher up in the card? That's like borderline title eliminator territory. And it's on the undercard for a fight like Hooker versus Puelas. Hooker Puelas is a better fight. It's a better fight to watch, but it has no real relevance. This does. Julio Arce versus Montel Jackson. Two guys that I thought the UFC would be really big in the UFC and just haven't really figured it out yet. Anyways, as per usual, you've got above, below, the side, to the left, to the right. Somewhere in there is a link to my link tree that has all of the places you can find this podcast: Anchor, Spotify, YouTube, and Acast right now, currently. Plus a link to the Discord channel, plus my Twitter, plus my Twitch, plus my YouTube gaming channel. So if any of that sounds cool, and the Discord particularly should, because it's got the MMA sim and the pro wrestling sim, which I think should really appeal to this audience. Check it out. And I will see you Sunday after this fight card, basically.